Well, thank you all for turning out, and very interesting to participate in this lecture series. The topic of tonight's talk isn't really quite as ominous as the title sounds. It's an effort to explain why this city has its odd physical shape. And I think you'll agree that it is a rather odd physical shape when you look at it. The pursuit of this question revealed not only the complex and long drawn-out process of building a city's territory, but also how at times this became a very contentious issue between Placentia and other neighboring cities. So here's an overview and some interesting highlights of how Placentia got its shape and just what it went through in getting it. What is Placentia? Well, that's an interesting question to begin with, because it's a name you will find on maps going quite a ways down, but covering sometimes a better part of northern Orange County and sometimes a little dot on the map. The first use of this name, not the name itself, but the area, was the Spanish land grant, Rancho San Juan Cajon de Santa Ana. Excuse me. This was granted to Juan Pacifico Ontiveros in 1837. And here you see, whoops, this is the map. You get some sense of how large the land grant was when you realize it encompassed all of present-day Fullerton, Anaheim, Brea, and Placentia. Placentia itself is largely this area here. Now, these boundaries are rather crude. Spanish diseños, as they were called, were based largely on natural resources, from this tree trunk to that hill and so forth. Basically, we wouldn't count on too much of them being left. Strangely enough, though, the east border that the Spanish gave to this land grant is today the Rose Drive, the east area of much of the city of Placentia. So some of these things have persevered. Now, in the early 1860s, this large grant was sold, most of it to two parties. Much of the area you see was bought by the land mogul Abel Stearns, but one part in here, the Kramer Trust, was bought by a German immigrant, Daniel Kramer. And he did something that was very foresightful. He divided up this tract into sort of rectangular tracts, which were about 20 to 40 acres square, much the same as those used by the federal government in its land surveys. And these tracts became a standard for defining borders and a very convenient way of denoting who owned what area. As more settlers came into the area, they established organizations to meet common needs, like irrigation districts, cooperative marketing associations, and a school system. Now, I raise that because that's where the word name Placentia comes on the scene. It's interesting, and one of the earlier things that settlers did in this area was to think of schools, and the district was run, a whole area, by a William McFadden. But when it came to naming the school district, at first what they used was simply part of a Spanish name and called it Cajon. A lot of people didn't like that. So they told McFadden's wife, would you come up with a name? And for reasons that are still kicked around by local historians, she came up with the name Placentia. And we've had it ever since. Now, the late 19th century also brought a major economic enterprise that lent itself very well to spatial definition, the citrus industry, more specifically the Valencia orange. This was actually first grown commercially just a few miles to the west of here, on the south side of what is now Cal State Fullerton, it became the major crop in Orange County by the turn of the century. My page is straight here. In 1910, the area obtained better transportation of its products when several local leaders, Albert Bradford, Charles Chapman, Richard Melrose, William Crowther, and Sam Kramer, persuaded the Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad to link its lines between Fullerton and Atwood. And by this time, oil wells were being drilled in much of the northern parts of this, and eastern parts of this area. And they even had a spur line go from the town of Richfield, later Atwood, all the way up to Olinda, which was becoming a center for oil drilling in the hills. So these activities are particularly interesting because around sometime in the 1910s, I don't know the date or the exactly why it was done, but a surveyor drew a map of this whole area, and notice the title that he gave it, Placentia and Vicinity, as though Placentia, which is on this map, this tiny little area here, it had just been incorporated as a town a few years before approximately this map was made, somehow gave its name to this entire area. It wasn't the first time that happened, nor the last. Anyway, the impression of an already crowded area, however, is a bit mistaken. You see all these lines drawn here and say, gee, God, are all these people living here? Not exactly. These rectangular areas here were orange groves with one or more ranchers, but a lot of these boxes here were claims to oil fields, or oil wells. Not necessarily anything built there. In fact, some whole towns that are shown here, like a town of Carlton, were actually fictitious towns, or ghost towns, very quickly. So here is Placentia, as I say, itself, down here, and it had just been incorporated, or just been platted out in 1910. Now, this initially consisted, next slide, of 4 blocks, these 4 here, and some streets for commerce, and some streets, whoops, for packing houses, and that was it. It had a couple of strange characteristics, and probably the strangest is that it is not crooked. This down here is the railroad tracks, and they went pretty straight east to west. Placentia didn't. Why not? Well, you can thank the man who first laid out his tract about a mile north on what is now Palm Avenue, J.C. Tuffrey. He had something he didn't like about absolutely rectangular or square cornered lots. So he put his border on an angle like that. And pretty soon, because he was one of the earliest to occupy this area, others began following suit, but it was Albert Bradford and Company, when they actually laid out the map of Placentia, who elected to use the angle that Tuffrey had used, and from then on, Placentia was stuck. As you can see, looking back at this area, most of the other surrounding land used straight streets. Placentia was unique in going Palm Drive on down. It used that strange angle. So that's one peculiarity of the shape of Placentia we find. All right, now, modest growth in urban areas amidst miles of orange groves and some oil fields continued through the 1930s and into World War II, as we can see in this. Well, first of all, this, incidentally, a sidelight, is Placentia Incorporated. In 1926, Placentia decided to become an incorporated city. As you can see, its shape had changed rather little from what it had been in 1910. Mostly, this was the school district. This area to the north were the first suburban tracts, you might say, in Placentia that were set up in the 1920s. Otherwise, very little had changed, including a peculiar angle. Now, between the 1930s and 1940s, Placentia grew very little. Some did have small communities around it, however, and that you begin to see from this map. Atwood was down here. Carlton was an oil town. It became a ghost town. Here is Yorba and here, just off the map, was the community of La Jolla. The interesting thing, however, is not those communities, but look at all the open land in between. In fact, to get an idea of the population, these black dots that you see running along Valencia Avenue and so forth were individual houses. So that's how many people were here. And this configuration of widely separated towns, vast areas of citrus, continued for some time. In fact, you get the most striking look at it probably from this photograph. This was taken about the mid-1950s. This is Placentia. That's the railroad track going through it. This is part of the La Jolla area. And look at all the rest of it. It's almost all citrus grove. Within a few years, that would change. Okay, now this landscape began to change in the 1950s for several reasons. One of these was disease. And in the late 1930s, a disease appeared on sour root orange trees in Brea, known as the quick decline, and very appropriately named. And each tree that was stricken with this within a few weeks was gone. Such was the devastation that wreaked in the Brea area that the major orange producer there ripped out all of his orange trees, something like 140,000, I think. The disease did carry over to some parts of Placentia, but most important, became sort of an omen, a suggestion that maybe citrus wasn't a smart thing to invest in. And that was the beginning of a decline of the citrus industry. A second factor that contributed to it was growing costs. As these orange groves were torn out for disease or other reasons, subdividers began coming in, and of course orange grove owners quickly found that they could make more money by selling their land than they could by trying to grow oranges. So that was a second factor that contributed to it. And finally, as one farmer put it, that and some other rising costs, tax and so forth, got to the point that it was more expensive to raise citrus than it was for to get the proceeds from the citrus. So as he put it, we weren't supporting the citrus. Pardon me, citrus weren't supporting us, we were supporting the citrus. Now there is a second important aspect to this changing times, and that was that as some of the areas changed from agriculture to urban, they created needs that farmers had never faced when they were just citrus groves. Urban streets, for example, sewers, public lighting. How do you get all of these funded? Well, maybe you make an area like a town that has taxation powers and can pay for all of these things. So maybe many of the people in the Placentia area began to undergo a different idea about urban environments and about city life. So the most important aspect of all of these things is that no longer were these areas so far apart, but rather they began to come closer together and finally raise the interesting question of which city would get a ranch or a tract that decided to subdivide and all of the taxes and other goodies that went with it. So it's at that point that we get down to about 1960, and this is the city of Placentia by then. Now, what is quite obvious here is there's still a lot of blank space, only certain areas. This is the old town here, pardon me. Still pressing the wrong buttons. There. This is the older area here. Come on, there we are. And then we have a couple of oddities. Two tracts that were set up quite a ways away from the rest of the city. That one quickly was joined by others and simply explained as the first area to come in. This one remains a mystery. To this day, this area of Placentia, from Palm up to, I forget what that street is, just west of Rose, is not part of Placentia. It is part of the County of Orange. You know, which completely surrounds, Placentia completely surrounds it. That has been, I was talking with Steve Fishel this afternoon. He confirmed that from time to time it suggested, hey, why don't you guys join the rest of us? And apparently the residents are not too interested in doing that. Now, there's one other odd thing I'll point out later on. Otherwise, though, we have all of this open area. A second interesting aspect of this is, lost my train of thought here. Oh yeah, the erratic boundaries. If you carefully follow the borders of Placentia, they hardly make any sense. I mean, why all this zigs and zags and so forth? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, each of these boxed areas here is a ranch or something like it to be sold individually, perhaps. So one rancher decides he wants to be in the city of Placentia, so he will vote for incorporation or agree to sell it to somebody who will put it in the city of Placentia. The next rancher might decide, no, I don't want to be in the city of Placentia. So you get this completely uneven definition of boundaries. Okay, so some way of getting more land for a city like Placentia, some way of perhaps bringing some order to all of this, boiled down to one power that cities had seldom used before the 1960s, and that is annexation. And that's where most of the fighting came. Okay, a couple of reasons why there was such contest for land by the 1950s on is the growth of population. In 1950, the whole of Orange County had 216,000 some odd people. By 1960, this had grown to 704,000. By 1970, it reached almost 1.5 million. Well, Placentia didn't quite follow suit, but almost. Placentia had barely doubled its population between 1926 and 1950. It had 1,682 in 1950. Then it took off to almost 6,000 by 1960 and tripled that to almost 22,000 by 1970. There was only one way to accommodate those people, and that was to begin to acquire more land. Okay, the main area of land became, or contest over land came up here in this area, where if you look carefully, you see that the boundary of Placentia goes up, then it starts going in, then it goes way in, then it comes back out and up. And this area, in case it looks unfamiliar, would eventually have a street running through it known as Urbanization Boulevard. And of course, what we know this area as now is the Crossroads Shopping Center. And if you haven't figured that out, Crossroads Shopping Center is largely in the city of Fullerton. How did that get pulled off? Well, that's an interesting story. The Parati residence, and incidentally, Mrs. Parati's house is still on Bradford, the west side of Bradford, just below Yorba Boulevard. You wouldn't know it for all the trees around there, but it is one of the interesting old historic houses. Anyway, she announced that she was selling her land, and a developer bought it. The developer then approached the city of Placentia with a proposal. I will annex my property into the city, I'll let you annex it into the city of Placentia, provided that on Bradford Avenue and this new Yorba Linda Boulevard that's going through, I want to build a gas station. Well, this was an interesting insight to the attitudes of people at that time. There was a lot of protests to the city council over building a gas station. Why? Well, this was going to bring urban roads, automobiles, and perhaps stores a whole lot of things that were not familiar to a rural citrus raising climate. So much was the hullabaloo they raised that the city council voted down the annexation. So that left this whole area, and the developer, well, what am I going to do with it? Well, next logical thing, I'll go to the city of Fullerton. The city of Fullerton said, fine. And the next thing Placentia knew, Fullerton had annexed all the way down to Bradford Avenue and was hungry to get more. And it might have gotten more. But then another interesting story comes up. The northern part of this, from about Palm North all the way up to Golden, was by and large still the property of the Tuffrey family. In fact, it's sometimes referred to as a Tuffrey subdivision. Jim and John were the two main Tuffrey brothers that owned this, and Jim did not like the idea of incorporating into anything. He was going to keep his land as it was. So for some time, he held out against incorporation, even as several leaders of Placentia began to see, hey, if we don't do something, I think Fullerton's going to take even more land in this area. But at that point, Fullerton one day sent a truck out to look at the Tuffrey property, and Jim Tuffrey noticed the truck on his property and went out and asked the one of the men in the truck what he was doing there. Oh, he said, I'm measuring your land. Measuring for what? Well, the city of Fullerton is planning to annex this property all the way through to Yorba Linda. And thought about it and finally called, well, I don't know, he had a phone probably, called his brother John, said, you know, I've told you I won't vote for annexation. I'm changing my mind. I'm going to vote for it. And gave him this story as to why he was changing his mind. He not only changed his mind, he began contacting other ranchers. Pretty soon there was quite a group of ranchers that got together, and collectively they pretty much resisted any further encroachments into this area. By then all Placentia had lost was the Crossroads Shopping Center. But that, of course, was all from the future. Now, the largest family holding in all of Placentia was the area you see here to the south, from about Alta Vista, well, actually north of Alta Vista, down to around Orangethorpe or further down. This was the property of the Kramer family. Actually, the Kramer families, because there's 7 different Kramers that own different parts of Placentia, some of Anaheim and some of Fullerton. This was the biggest potential prize, you might say, to an expansion or a restriction of Placentia. So the city did send some people to meet with the Kramer families from time to time and try to get them to agree to be annexed by Placentia. Finally, there was a meeting held in which members of this family would all come to decide whether or not they wanted to accept Placentia's offer of annexation. One of the leading members of the family, Edna Kramer, was the wife of the late Sam Kramer, and she was very gung-ho for annexation. But she had a sister-in-law who was not. So as the story goes, this sister-in-law, incidentally, had several characteristics, one of which was a fondness for liquor. So anyway, the whole group of Kramers were brought together by the city one day, and almost everybody was there, but this one woman wasn't there. Ray Pound, the mayor, was very glad in some ways she wasn't, I guess, but wondering what the reason was when Edna came up to him and said, Ray, I went over to see my sister-in-law, and I took her a bottle, and I don't think she's here today. And I don't think there's going to be a vote against Placentia, and there was not. All the Kramers there voted to go into Placentia, and that is one of the reasons that much of this whole land area here was acquired by Placentia at the end of the 1950s. I thought, incidentally, of that when I did my research work for this. The city very nicely let me look at their files, went into the engineering department, which does all the mapping, and all these detailed maps, much more detailed than this, all of the descriptions of how streets ran and so forth. I couldn't help but thinking whether there were other cases in which there would be a simpler way of working out the acquisition of property or something like that. If a bottle could change the whole fate of a Kramer property. Okay, going on to the next area. This is Placentia in 1960. This is Placentia in 1968. Notice that between all the ranchers selling their property and some other moves, Placentia had acquired quite a bit of additional land and developed quite a bit of the area, especially in the north and the east, that had been orange groves a few years earlier. In fact, the main thrust was to the east into Yorba Linda. And here is where Placentia changed its sort of appearance a bit. Being a defender of property against the aggression of Fullerton, it became somewhat the aggressor in taking over parts of Yorba Linda. That is one reason for the very strange configuration here. That is an area of Yorba Linda that they did not annex. For much of the area around there, they did. And one of the reasons that they annexed a good deal of Yorba Linda was that Yorba Linda stubbornly remained unincorporated until 1967. Well, partly stubbornly and partly for legal reasons. At this time, state law required that if an area wanted to be incorporated and there was any significant controversy over it, the entire property owning population would vote on it. Well, what was property? Well, property was land or mineral rights, oil and gas. Well, the oil and gas people said, heck, if we get incorporated, we'll be taxed. I don't want to do that. So most of the oil and gas people in the Yorba Linda area got together 3 different times in the late 50s and early 60s to vote against incorporation. On the other hand, and Placentia saw this as an opportunity, so did Anaheim, so did Brea. Each of those cities in these elections offered the voters of Yorba Linda an interesting option: merge into our city. And Placentia was a real pusher. Why don't you just join Placentia? Forget about all this incorporation business. And until 1965, they didn't get very far. But in 1965, there was a meeting at which, according to sources, Yorba Linda residents seriously thought they might possibly merge into Placentia. And they may have been intrigued by one of the options that Placentia had. You know, Placentia-Yorba Linda, we've used that before. We've used it in a school district and so forth. In fact, let's take a look at what the school district encompasses. This area in here, incidentally, was the city of Yorba Linda at that time. This is the county border with San Bernardino County. This is roughly the Santa Ana River. This is what Placentia officials seriously proposed would be this merged town of Placentia and Yorba Linda. It never got too far, never got far enough to be officially brought through, but it's fascinating to think of what Placentia might look like if this had occurred. Okay, back to the... So anyway, this was all in limbo. Yorba Linda people thinking they might want to merge when a state court rethought the whole idea that mineral rights were voting rights and said, no, they're not. And as soon as Yorba Linda found that, hey, we can have another election in which all these oil-holding people don't vote, they dropped the whole idea of merging with Placentia, held another election in 1967, at which more than 3-to-1 the voters of Yorba Linda voted to incorporate. As an incorporated city, they were pretty hard to take anything over. So that was the end of any problems in the eastern border, almost. But not quite. There was one more factor that was beginning to come into the scene, and that is that maybe when you try to annex property, it isn't just the amount of land that you should be interested in. It's the revenue that might go off this land. And one place that I would really be interested in is this extension of Yorba Linda Boulevard, which, as you can see, is dotted lines on this map, just beyond Rose Avenue. Go down there in your memory, and on the south side, what do you have? Fairway Ford. You used to have across the street another auto dealer. What richer source of revenues from sales taxes and so forth than a couple of auto agencies? So, Placentia officials took another look at that court case in which the court had said oil holders and so forth can't vote, their rights, only people can, and said, but there's one condition they put in there, that the uses of the land might be modified. They could adjust the uses. So Placentia came up with an idea. All right, we'll take this Yorba Linda Boulevard east of Rose, and Placentia will take all of the commercial property, and Yorba Linda can have the residential. Well, obviously, which one got the greater amount of sales taxes and so forth? That was Yorba Linda. They cried foul, but finally, in the end, decided not to sue, and that's the way, one of the reasons that Yorba Linda, Placentia has wound up with some interesting businesses along eastern Yorba Linda Boulevard. Okay, to wind up quickly with a couple of other interesting examples. The southwest border. This is an example of a more largesse attitude by Placentia. That was the longtime town of La Jolla, formed on the turn of the century, largely by Mexicans who built houses, a few stores, a school by 1914. And this was a colonia, as it was sometimes called, a place for people who wanted to do work in the fields to live, where the pickers would come down, or the ranchers would come down and hire them as they saw fit. It had a lot of things that were unattractive, largely dirt streets, no sewers, no public lighting. And so some wondered why the Placentia government in the early 1950s pondered taking it in. But they saw advantages and also some good things they could do for the property. So in the early 1950s, in bits and pieces, this area was all added to the city of Placentia. Then, although I don't think this term is officially used, years later there would be what I call a de-annexation, when Caltrans decided had decided quite some time ago, it was going to build a freeway right through the middle of the La Jolla area. And if you drive through La Jolla to this day, you find houses whose backyards are steeply banked freeway sides. So that was both the plus and minus side, you might say, of the La Jolla annexation. Then we have one other contentious issue, and that was the encroachment from the south by the city of Anaheim. And Anaheim was probably the most aggressive of all cities in the north part of the county in taking over other land, especially by a technique known as strip annexation. This was a way that Anaheim managed to go from Anaheim, a flat surface south of Fullerton, all the way to Anaheim Hills and take over the hills. So it looked like it was the beginning to do that sort of thing in this, in this area. I'll go one ahead. The main part of contention was this area right down here, which had originally been known as Richfield, then became Atwood, and that was a workers' town that was not in terribly good shape from about the 1930s on. It was depressed. The oil industry had gone into a sort of eclipse in this area, and there was very little new money or anything coming in. Things weren't helped too much in March 1938 when the Santa Ana River took away part of Atwood also. So, however, in the late 1960s, the oil fields in this area started being revitalized. So not only Placentia, but Yorba Linda and Anaheim all got interested in taking this area over, all offered to annex the area. And that led to a long series of rather messy court decisions on who had the right. But ultimately, Placentia came out winning because once again it had sort of a largesse attitude, where Anaheim and Yorba Linda made it clear what they really wanted was that part of Atwood that had been declared commercial zoning, and that's where you could drill for oil. Placentia said it would take the whole area, including the downtrodden residential area, and devote money to upgrading that. So the Local Agency Formation Commission, which by this time was settling problems like this, awarded the area to Placentia. Anaheim wouldn't give up. Anaheim filed suits against this warrant, and they dragged on to 1971, when finally a court tossed out all of Anaheim's protests and said that Fullerton had a much better plan for the area, and Atwood became part of Fullerton. Now, there was a closing sort of nice tone to that. The year before this, 1971, the city of Fullerton had appealed, or had made a petition to the All-American City Commission, which took 9 cities each year and named them All-American cities for good things that they had done for their community or adjacent communities. And in the case of Placentia said, look what we have done with Atwood. We have annexed all of it, downtrodden urban areas as well as lucrative petroleum areas. We brought in police protection and so forth. And the All-American Cities Committee was impressed. So in 1972, Placentia became one of just 9 cities in the United States to be named an All-American City. That, I think, is a very fitting note for an otherwise kind of controversial topic of fighting over the streets. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to take any questions that you have. Yes?
Where can we find these old maps?
All right, some of them in the history room of the library right here. Wendy, would you like to say a few things about the history room?
Sure, yeah. Dr. DeGraff did quite a bit of his research here in the history room as well as at the city. So if you'd like to come and visit the history room, you're welcome to come anytime the library is open, and you can ask for access. I do recommend if you have a specific time and date you want to come, you can contact me directly, and we can make sure that we can set an appointment so that the room is available, and of course I'm available to help you with any sort of research you have. I do want to note that the history room is curated with stuff from the public, so if you guys have anything in your homes, whether it's old photographs, newspaper clippings, anything about the city of the Placentia, we would love to have it in our history room, whether it's a gift to us directly, or if you just want to have us scan it or copy it so that it's available to others, and of course you keep the original, we would love to do that as well. We can only preserve the history that you guys give us, so we need to start collecting a little bit more.
Okay, yeah.
Can I go to the map because I have a specific question about
Oh, sure.
And you may not know the answer, but you certainly enlightened me about a lot of stuff today.
Mm-hmm.
So this area, this unincorporated island,
Yeah.
is actually part of a housing tract. Where's the Yorba Linda Boulevard? Is it right here?
Yeah.
Okay. So we live here, but this is all part of the same housing tract. It was Charles Wagner. Okay?
Oh.
And what's interesting to me, having done a little bit of research, is there's a Wagner house here and a Wagner house here.
Right.
And north and south of it is Placentia, and in between is unincorporated.
That is interesting.
And I had done some reading that there was a big fight between Yorba Linda and Placentia in that one area. And I didn't understand how it could be that our housing tract is split. And so
That's interesting. I didn't realize.
That happened in 1963.
Oh, no, I didn't.
What is that white box? Is that Fullerton?
No, it's
No, this is the county.
county land.
Yeah.
So if you go down, Cedar Lawn is Placentia, but Cedar Lawn is not Placentia.
Oh, that's why the kids smoke right there.
Oh, now the cat is out of the bag.
Placentia PD won't respond in that white box.
So yeah, so there was there's some city. I was trying to find the city council minutes online and had a hard time finding out. Like, why did that happen?
Yeah, no,
And I think part of it is the white area,
Mhm.
those houses were built a year before ours. It was a large housing tract, built by the Cinderella Company.
all right,
So I was thinking, when you said that the owners had to vote,
yes,
I'm thinking that the original owners who bought the
Okay.
first houses.
now you're
voted
filling in
to
some
not
gaps.
be in, but then how did Placentia then, I guess, annex the rest before they could lose it all?
Okay, there was a thrust by Placentia early in the 60s and about this area, and Cinderella Tract A was a major target. So I guess, and part of that, Placentia was able to take over, and part of it was not. So that probably, I'll have to do some more research there, but I do know that was one of the big acquisitions that Placentia got, was Cinderella Tract A, someplace around here. Yes?
When the city wanted to take over, what were the reasons that people wanted to be annexed or not? Was it mainly taxes?
Well, an annexation would bring you city services, police and fire. Somebody said that you could smoke in this area here and not get arrested. Well, the opposite. If you could be sure that somebody who was trying to smoke or something would be arrested, you wanted to be annexed to a legal entity that had the power to do that. I mean, it was a little bit easier to get a local police officer to respond to some problem than to get the sheriff's office, which is the only thing you have for a county. So that was one reason. Another was infrastructure. The cities would issue bonds that would cover the building of sewers, public lighting, so forth. And that was just usually, now maybe given Placentia's current plight, that's not as true, but usually a bit easier to bring about dealing with a city than to wait until the whole county set up that. So these would be some of the reasons. All right, other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming, and you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Dr. DeGraff.
Yeah.